Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning again and good afternoon to colleagues who are connected online. So I think we had a fantastic opening plenary that has really set the stage very well for this conversation, for this first session. So as we said this morning, really we are in a very troubling and dangerous world when we see at the geopolitical tensions and conflict on the rise. And that's why really we felt for this forum that we needed to see how we can adapt and innovate in face of these issues. So that's why we'll spend the next hour with this panel that I'm sure needs no introduction. You have very glad to have this great panel. Some of the panel members were telling me after listening to Femi, Sukaina, are you going to read our minds as well? I said, I might. I don't know. I might. So I'm going to start with Frank. Frank, as many people know Frank, he's really has great experience in development and in fragility. He was the former Fragility FCV director. He's really someone who has led our FCV strategy. So we're very happy. And now to have you in the panel. Now Frank works across the street for the IMF. So Frank, we heard at the opening ceremony about the worsening global landscape affecting fragility and conflict around the world. But help us just situate, please, the conversation with some data. How have FCS economies been affected by these recent crises and shocks compared to more stable countries? And what does the data tell us about treating fragility, conflict, and violence as a global public bad? Over to you, Frank.
Can you hear me? Yes? Great. Well, first, thank you, Sukaina. I would like first to thank the World Bank, Sukaina, and your team for the organization of this forum. You know, in a time of geopolitical fragmentation, having the IFI, the World Bank, the IMF, and other organizations being a place of platform of discussion on issues that could be quite sensitive is actually very important. We have this forum, which for me is one of the most important gatherings of actors that don't have the same mandate, talking about peace, security, humanitarian development, and that actually exchanging best practice like we heard from Anabiade and trying to see how we can move forward. So I just want to recognize for just 1 second the importance of humility, learning from each other, and more importantly, not talking to the same people, but talking to actors that you have not engaged. And that's exactly what the Fragility Forum is bringing. You also have the CIPRI Forum, the Humanitarian Forum, very soon from the European Commission. And those are important platforms of discussion this specific time. So some numbers. Well, first, I would like to say that, of course, we heard it a little bit from the first panel, but fragile and conflict-affected states are clearly considered very often among the most vulnerable members of the international community. If you are looking at all the challenge that those countries are facing, and I have to say, I feel a little bit humbled by the fact that Deputy Prime Minister, Minister next to me are actually on the front line, and they know better this challenge than anybody else. But if you look at it, each fragile country is fragile in its own way, but there are some common challenges. Extreme poverty, the whole issue about governance, we heard about it as well, the whole topic about having difficulty in providing basic services across the territory, whole difficulty in providing justice, security. So obviously those countries are already starting from a very vulnerable basis. And in addition, they are being impacted by all the different types of shock, internally, but also externally. As a result, since you asked me from data coming from the IMF, just the key points. One, number of conflict events is at the highest since World War II. In fact, what is important to note is not only that over the past year, from 2022 to 2023, the number of conflict events has increased by 40%, but also the number of fatality due to conflict has increased by 30%, but also that the nature of conflict has changed by having conflict that now the average time for conflict is about 30 years, which is twice more than what it used to be from the 90s. And therefore, remaining engaged is not something new, it's actually something extremely important, especially for international finance institutions. Forced displacement, we heard a number from Anabiade. It's good to see a number of colleagues from UNHCR here. 114 million people forcibly displaced, the highest as well. In terms of food insecurity, which countries are the most vulnerable? Well, if you look at FAO, WFP, the numbers are clear. Out of 21 countries that are considered as hotspot in terms of hunger, 15 are fragile and conflict-affected states. And last but not least, in terms of extreme poverty, again, you're going to see that if you don't focus on fragile and conflict-affected states, very difficult to look at eradication of poverty. So those are the numbers, worsening fragility and conflict landscape. Now, macroeconomic implication, and we'll finish on this end, is very clear. Unfortunately, the landscape is also worsening. You have seen over the past year, especially with COVID, but not only, we have seen a worsening of the key indicators. Let's take a few on. Inflation. 15% is the average inflation for fragile and conflicted states in 2022, and it would be about 10%, still very significant. If you look at the per capita income, quite important. Well, actually, you are going to finally, in 2024, have the level you have in 2019. So it's a half-decade loss for people in those countries. And last but not least, if you look at the level of debt, we talk a lot about debt. Well, we have about 20 countries that are fragile and conflict-affected states that are either at debt distress or in high risk of debt distress. This is about 50% of the total number of fragile and conflicted states. So unfortunately, we see not only a worsening of the situation in terms of fragility and conflict, also, obviously, the macroeconomic implications are there, and there is a risk of divergence from those countries from the rest of the world. Last but not least, why is it a global public bad? I think Anna Biarde mentioned it. Like our managing director is saying, conflict and travel cross borders. And therefore, this notion of spillover is extremely important. Helping fragile and conflict-affected states is not only important for those countries first, and the people of those countries, but also because fragility and conflict cross border. And there is a whole notion about tackling fragility and conflict as a global public good, which includes, by the way, providing tailored approach, tailored support, but also grant, concessional financing. This is why IDA is so important, especially for this group of countries. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Frank. And yeah, very bleak landscape and compounding crises that are making our work much more difficult. Let me turn now to Her Excellency Minister Barley. Madam Minister, you wear two very different but very important hats. One as Minister of Government of Sierra Leone, but as well you're head of what some may know as the G7+, which is the organization regrouping fragile countries from all regions of the world. So we really would like to hear from you, Madam Minister, because as we all know, Sierra Leone suffered from acute fragility for many years and protracted conflict as well. Yet, it was able to overcome some of those obstacles, but still dealing with some challenges. Reflecting on your own country's experience, how can the international community better help a country like Sierra Leone, or for that matter, countries in active conflict? What has worked, and where or what do we need to do better?
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you for acknowledging that I wear two hats. I actually wear three hats. I'm also the co-chair of the International Dialogue for Peace Building and State Building. So it's three hats, so that's why I didn't put on my local headgear that goes with this outfit, too many hats. But yes, Sierra Leone over the years has been in situations of fragility through conflict, a protracted war, but also Ebola, lingering economic crisis, lingering COVID-19, and more recently, intermittent spates of violence. But we have come out of it probably battle-scarred, but more wiser. And that's why we are now playing major roles in international fora. We now have non-permanent status in the Security Council and other security fora on the continent. So that has been as a result of what we have gone through as a country. And also I would like to acknowledge that we are no longer on the bank's FCS. We exited in 2019, but we are still on the OECD list for fragile states. But we don't see this as a weakness. We just see this as a commitment to really looking deeply on what needs to be done and sharing it with others. So coming to your question as to what we can learn from our experience in Sierra Leone, I would like to, first of all, there are 3 areas that I want to focus on. Very briefly, I know we don't have much time, but I also want to emphasize or re-emphasize the issue that was raised by one of the speakers previously, and that is prevention. Prevention is less costly than dealing with the outcomes of the conflict, both in resources and its toll on human beings. So I would put that first. You know, that we need to have more global emphasis on prevention. But areas that we have benefited from in Sierra Leone, one is through the support in the pursuit of peace through peacemaking and dialogue. A number of countries I know during their conflicts do go through peace talks. We did have a round of peace talks, and you know, you have peace talk 1, peace talk 2, you go back. But you keep at it, and I think we benefited from that in Sierra Leone, from the dialogue, from the UN, from the African Union, from ECOWAS. That was useful in resolving our conflict. And I think a number of countries need to be engaged in dialogue. And of course, it's the international communities for countries that cannot do it internally. The second area is through the provision of security sector forces to help the government to deal with armed conflict and justice issues, and to promote the protection of civilians that are in harm's way. We also had peacekeeping forces through over the course of our conflict, and I think that now that a number of international organizations are supporting, especially the UN agreement with member states to support actually regional-led peacekeeping forces and stabilize operation is a very significant move, because this will ensure more proverbial skin in the game for African countries to actually actively promote peace and security. The third area, and I think this is where the most work needs to be done, and continuing support is in state-building efforts. And for over the conflicts, during our conflicts and a number of conflicts, the international community has been engaged in short-term solutions. I think there needs to be more longer-term solutions. And I would like to encourage, I do acknowledge and commend the fact that state building is slowly coming back to the international agenda, including a session on this during the Fragility Forum. I'm also encouraged to see that the bank's direct budget support and policy lending has tripled to FCV settings. And I would also like to acknowledge and applaud the IMF strategy for fragile states. These agendas must be at the forefront, they're the front and center, since countries in active conflict will continue to spiral if its institutions and policies and markets are not strengthened. They will collapse and go into further conflict. So I think, well, in summary, those are the 3 areas, and but I think my time is up, and I'll come back to some of these issues.
Thank you very much. But I think all very important and resonate with what we're trying to do here in terms. And if you look at our FCV strategy, prevention is key. We said one study said that $1 invested in prevention yield to 16 dollars. So it's a good investment, but it's not an easy one, as Anna Berdier has mentioned it. And of course, thank you for mentioning the importance of partnership and the importance of security sector as well. So all those lessons are well taken. So let me turn now to Professor Mary Calder. So you've done extensive work on the changing structure of conflict as Director of Conflict and Civicness Research Group at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And this includes, of course, some important research on the nature of conflict and the growing role of non-state actors and other networks. What does current and recent research tell us about the structure and incentives driving modern warfare, and what does it mean for peace agreements?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me. I think it's important to understand fragility and conflict almost as a kind of social condition. You know, you talk a lot about resilience, but the real resilience is fragility and conflict. As Frank pointed out, wars last 30 years. The really resilient actors are the armed groups and the criminal gangs. And I think one way to think about this is not in a classic sense of a war as a deep-rooted contest, but more as a kind of social system in which the various warring parties, whether they're state or non-state, actually gain from violence itself. Our colleague from Bosnia said earlier, people don't win wars any longer. They don't try even to defeat their enemies. What they want is a situation in which they can make very specific gains from violence on a long-term basis, and those gains might be political. They might be mobilizing people around extremist ideologies. They might be constructing sectarian hatred. Or they might be economic. That is to say that you make money from looting, you make money from setting up a checkpoint, from taking a hostage, you make money from the chaos, which allows you to do all kinds of smuggling. And so it's this combination, I mean, it's usually both of political and economic incentives that keep these conflicts going on over and over again. And the problem is that most of our recipes, most of our sort of playbook for these conflicts are based on the assumption that it's a deep-rooted contest. So peace agreements is a very good kind of example, but you could show it was the same whether you're talking about justice systems, security, all of the policies that we tend to put forward, including state capacity building, tend to backfire because there isn't an understanding of the resilience of this social system. So in the case of peace agreements, well, first of all, it's very difficult to bring the warring parties to the table because they have an interest in continuing violence. But if you do, it's only because you have found a way to entrench their position in some complicated constitution, just like, again, our Bosnian friend was describing, in which they can remain in power forever and continue their predatory activities. And actually, I think Bosnia is a wonderful example. We've talked such a lot about Bosnia already. But, you know, Duska explained how much money was spent, how many troops, but it's still dysfunctional, and still many of the warlords remain in power because of this hugely complex constitution that was established. So, you know, we need to rethink how we do peace agreements. I guess I don't have time to talk a lot about it, but I'd just like to mention a few things. First of all, I think the point my neighbor just made about process. There's no single magic bullet agreement, but keeping the process going, having lots of small agreements is really important. Secondly, the agreements need to be about concrete things like ceasefires, ending sieges, access to humanitarian aid, rather than political constitutions. You can't do political constitution making with a bunch of extremists. You need to involve others. Thirdly, and that is obviously that you need to involve others, you need as much as possible to involve civil society and women. That's often very difficult, but even if you do it, as has happened in the Syria talks, in a parallel way, that's quite important in giving them more significance on the ground. And then finally, I think it has to be multi-level. The point, again, that Frank made, it's not just that these are conflicts that never end, it's also that they're transnational. It's also that the armed groups are usually part of transnational networks of organized groups. It's also that the ideologies are part of transnational networks. It's also through the movement. So you need to be, and I think the point of this whole forum that we're in a situation of global fragmentation and geopolitical competition. That makes everything worse. That feeds into this. And we're just seeing it happen before our very eyes in the Middle East. We're seeing the spread of this kind of social condition that could take over more and more parts of the world. So we also need to be really working at a global level to bring about some kind of consensus and to prevent the competition. But at the same time, I think very key to our way of thinking about it, and when you come to ask me again, I'll talk more about this, is to try to reverse the social condition which might be possible at a local level. So local agreements, I think, are very important. And actually, one of our findings is that, interestingly, in contemporary conflicts, the number of local agreements have been increasing. There are hundreds of local agreements. Some of them are really horrible local agreements. They're tactical agreements between the warring parties. But some of them are very good local agreements. They're agreements to have ceasefires, to improve the welfare of the population. And what we find is that when the conditions for a good agreement are first the involvement of civilians, and secondly, interestingly, multilateral actors, not geopolitical actors, there are hundreds of agreements in Syria which involve Iran and Russia, which actually tend to make things worse. I'm talking about agreements involving the UN, the African Union, international institutions who come and give that agreement some degree of legitimacy and who can support the inclusion of local civilians. I won't go on about it, but because I've already taken up too much time, but I just wanted to finally say, if we think in these terms as this process as a sort of long-term social condition, then thinking about how to reverse that social condition, what needs to happen to reverse that social condition, what needs to happen to have resilience in the sense the World Bank is using it, I'll come to in the next question.
Thank you, Professor. And it's good that you're shedding a light on peace agreement, on local agreement, but as well on something that probably tend to overlook. We have the losers of FCV, of fragility and of conflict and violence, population, mainly women, children, but unfortunately we have the winners, people that have vested interest in having those conflicts enduring, and that's a very a good reminder. So I'll turn now to Deputy Prime Minister of Somalia, Mr. Sane. You have really impressive history in working in support of so many dimensions of your country's journey towards stability. This include overseeing the provisional constitution, but as well the social safety net program, which is a very important one in Somalia, supported by the World Bank, including using country system, which for us is extremely important. By many accounts, Somalia has made remarkable progress, and successive governments have worked hard over last few years to build resilience, and really to reduce the impact of conflict as well as natural disasters. Based on Somalia's ongoing progress, but also its remaining challenge, which we know you still have, what lessons would you like to share as your country tries to move from fragility to resilience? Let's crack that nut of resilience.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm being heard. Thank you very much. It's indeed quite an honor for me to be here and listen to the experiences and the insights from people from across the globe, both as practitioners who study and observe the developments in countries like ours that have had a history of dealing with conflict and fragility and violence, and also people who experience these things firsthand. And looking at this very beautiful crowd, I see more of observers of fragility than mostly people who have experienced it firsthand. So I'm not going to bombard you with statistics and numbers of what fragility means. You are more experienced than me in analyzing these issues. But perhaps I can give you some context of what fragility entails. And I would begin with by answering the question raised by the previous moderator, what brings me here? I would like to start with this observation that the discussion on fragility, violence, and conflict is first and foremost a discussion about humans, about people, about life and death. That is what it means. So it's a very honorable subject matter to indulge in. If I can use my own personal experience, I was born at a time when my country was at war with another country. I left Somalia not out of my choice, but at a time when it was at war with itself. And I found myself studying with students from Afghanistan. We both did not know what brought us together to India, but we were just a product of violence. Then when I moved to Canada, I tried to study why did I have to go through that journey. And apparently my country is presented as the typical classic example of a failed state. So that's what brings me here, to tell you a better story about my country and my people. We're out of failure, and very soon, as the Prime Minister of Chad has identified as his objective, we are also working very hard to get out of fragility. So the story of Somalia that I'm going to tell you is intended to change some of the perceptions I am afraid many of you hold. And a lot of people that I meet in international forums ask me. The questions they ask me start with, how are the warlords of 1992 doing? Like Ali Mahdi and I did. That is something so of the past. So I'm hoping you guys are at least 20, 30 years forward from that position. Somalia has just completed a HIPC initiative, a very difficult and a great experience to go through as a state. With fiscal discipline, budgetary processes, public financial management, a whole host of policy, regulatory, programmatic work that was intended to improve our institutional capacity to manage finances and hopefully have a better economy. Somalia has also had the opportunity now to join the East African Economic Community. Somalia is part of COMESA. Somalia has just finalized or finished or met the requirements for the lifting of arms embargo that was on us for such a long time. So there is a lot of positive news about Somalia, particularly on the side of governance and state building. But there is also the other side, which is part and parcel of today's theme, which is the role of private sector in resilience building and dealing with fragility and conflict. Somalia has one of the most vibrant private sectors. In the absence of the state, in the absence of a supportive and conducive environment, Somalia's telecommunications sector is much more advanced than many African countries and many of our regional countries. Access to internet is even very exemplary. So there are both difficulties and opportunities. That is what I would like to highlight. As we speak, we are in a post-HIPC environment where we are trying to grapple with the realities that prevail in Somalia. So we're caught between three different situations. On most of the day, across the government, as I oversee a different set of ministries, we have to deal with reoccurring and cyclical crises of either in the form of floods or the fear of famine. And that happens within a period of 6 months. I have seen a household that has lost a family member during a drought and during a flood within a time span of 6 months. That's what fragility means for us. On the other hand, there are a series and a very really useful set of policies and programs in place in collaboration with our partners, primarily the World Bank, that try to address some of the root causes of our vulnerabilities. Some of them are within the broader framework of human capital development. For the first time, the Somali government has recruited over 6,000 public sector teachers so that we can improve, as the Prime Minister of Chad and others have identified, the quality of schooling of our children. For the first time, we're investing through country systems on health sector. Why am I highlighting these very specific examples? It was the absence of country systems and viable state institutions that was the root cause of the vulnerabilities to begin with. So there is private sector, there are NGOs, but the missing link used to be the role of the Somali state. And increasingly, I'll give you one simple example. When in 2001, the drought hit Somalia and we had a famine, poor households, mothers and children and the elderly had to walk hundreds of kilometers from all directions to try to get to Mogadishu. But today, when people are in difficult situation, they go to the regional capitals of the federal member states. They go to Garowe, they go to Baydhabo, they go to, so the decentralization model of federalism is helping in service delivery. People don't have to try to come to Mogadishu and hope that the international community would arrive there. So improving intergovernmental relations, capacity of institutions is very important. Another important variable that has come into the picture is the security institutions of Somalia and rule of law. We cannot even talk about delivery and dealing with fragility if we do not defeat Al-Shabaab, which is, really controlling a significant part of our country, and millions of Somalis live under them, and they have no access to school, they have never seen vaccination or health or anything. So for us to cope with issues of fragility and conflict and violence means eradicating Al-Shabaab. Therefore, we have a serious agenda for the last year and a half to defeat Al-Shabaab, and we have successfully been able to recapture a lot of land and liberate a lot of Somalis from their claims. Insecurity and violence have to be addressed first before we talk about development and dealing with recurring crises. So to connect all the dots, the coping, because another key thematic area is how do we adapt to and innovate in the light of this recurring crisis. I would say it needs a very comprehensive, across the government approach, in collaboration with the private sector, and in meaningful partnerships with our international institutions and donors and supporters who help us to work on a very common agenda. A simple example in Somalia is, with 67 million livestock and about 17 million people, on everyday basis, at least 4 to 7 million Somalis are at the risk of hunger and food crisis. And we lose at least 3, 4 million, 6 million, 10 million of our livestock when it doesn't rain for 4 years, which is unprecedented prior to the advent of climate change impact. And $11 billion have been spent on humanitarian response for the last many years. Imagine if we spend $11 billion in trying to fix the water problem of Somalia. We have a very rudimentary project, a significant one, but small in the grand scheme of things, and a program run by the World Bank in collaboration with the federal government that addresses water issues. So if I were to identify a few issues, is water, livelihoods and productivity, and in strengthening government institutions. In the absence of viable state institutions, working single-handedly and solely with NGOs would only produce, at best, keeping the status quo, but it cannot bring about a transformational change, because there are some services that we are realizing after liberating new areas from Al-Shabaab that cannot be outsourced to NGOs. And those include rule of law, provision of justice, policing, and protection of vulnerable communities, and things of that. I spoke for a bit way too much, but that is the context of Somalia. And finally, it is a story of hope and positive development, but it's not a finished story. It needs partnerships to continue and reach the ultimate point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister. I think that you really pointed very key issues in terms of climate crisis, how it's compounding crisis, but as well resilience through a whole government approach, focusing on economic resilience, improving security, rule of law, building capacity, building the states. I think all those are extremely relevant to the conversation and resonate well with what we heard earlier this morning. And I think that's a good segue for me to turn to Assistant Secretary General Abdallah Al-Dardari. You've served Mr. ASG in Afghanistan, and now you cover many countries in your current role, including Gaza and other FCV hotspots. What is your sense, based on what you heard here, but as well on your experience, of lessons learned or lessons we should have learned, and how we can better work together to support development in rapidly changing conflict situation? We think that partnership has been really mentioned here as key for us, not only to remain engaged as development partners, but as well it's necessary but not sufficient, as Deputy Prime Minister has mentioned. We have as well to invest in government system. We have to build state capability. Over to you.
Thank you, Sukaina. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I did attend the Fragility Forum at the bank when I was at the bank. So it's great to be here sitting on in another capacity. I think the Deputy Prime Minister gave us a great example of what I wanted to say. So let me first, for my presence here to be a bit useful, I would like to dispel the notion that the humanitarian development peace nexus is a sequential nexus. We start with the humanitarian work, we wait until there is a moment to start development, and meanwhile we'll be looking at a peace process. It doesn't work like this. It is not linear. And what we are finding out now, that there is no more enough money for humanitarian assistance to sustain these societies. And as you all know, at the moment, almost for all humanitarian appeals in the world, the maximum rate of funding doesn't reach 20%. So imagine if we did not believe in Somalia's ambitions, and we kept insisting that everything we need to do in Somalia is only humanitarian assistance. That story of hope would not have materialized. So what we need to make sure that once, even if the bombs are still falling, we need to work on development. And I was in Afghanistan, and on the 15th of August when Taliban took over, I was in Kabul, and the slogan for me was stay and deliver development. And almost everyone else was saying, are you out of your mind? Development under Taliban? In those 2 years before I left, we created 1 million jobs for Afghan people. And we supported 70,000 women-owned enterprises that are now the backbone of local economy in Afghanistan. While now humanitarian assistance is going down. Sorry, World Food Program doesn't have enough money to provide food. I give you another example why we should not hesitate about stepping into development on the day or when the conflict starts. Well, we started planning for Gaza reconstruction on the 7th of October, in that evening. And it's already too late. People say, but it's too early, it's a humanitarian situation. It is already too late if there is some sort of ceasefire in the foreseeable future. Another example, Syrian refugees on average moved inside Syria 5 times, seeking education and electricity before they decided to leave the country. And the international community, and I'm not politically correct here, insisted on staying with only food aid and humanitarian assistance. Now 90% cut in food aid, and the agricultural system for a country that used to be an exporter of food is totally decimated. So I think we have enough lessons to insist on development and move from funding to financing quickly, because funding will never make it. UNDP spends in the Arab states region $1 billion a year. Okay, it's a good amount of money. I tick the boxes. We are doing good delivery, all of that. But what is $1 billion in the region of 350 million people? Now, if we combine our grant funding with what the World Bank and other IFIs are doing, the impact will be higher. But even if we do that, it's not enough. We need to leverage private sector, and we need to leverage market forces to help move out of where we are of this situation into a new. The paradigm shift will not happen with grant funding. So moving from funding to financing and insisting on development on day one of the conflict, plus prevention, these are key issues today. We cannot leave out of this Fragility Forum without actually saying how we will do this. So I'm seeking from these 3 days the how. Okay, we know what needs to be done. We have some pilots and experiences. Somalia is one of them. But we need to have much more detailed on the operationalization of these concepts. Because what's happening is that even if we have learned all these lessons, a crisis happens and immediately our inclination is, let's provide humanitarian aid, which is fine, we need. I'll tell you now from our initial assessments in Gaza, we will have to live with development and humanitarian aid for at least next 10 years. So I'm not saying they are mutually exclusive. I'm saying how do we have the most optimal combination of humanitarian aid, development assistance, funding and financing while building institutions and resilience of national institutions. Let me stop here now. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do as an institution, but I agree with you. As I said earlier, we need to learn more, we need to do more. Now we're running out of time. I'll come back to you about resilience, so prepare. I want to really you to help us understand resilience, which is one of our 4 themes for this forum. But as I said this morning, we have 5,000 people registered in person and online. So I want to turn to my colleague Bala to see if I have any questions online before I turn back to the floor here.
Thank you, Sukena and panelists. Excellent session. Lots of response online. We have like 350 plus online attendees, and questions are plenty and very diverse. Let me start with the first question. How do you differentiate, if you do, prevention from anticipatory action? The approach that systematically links early warnings to actions to protect lives, livelihoods, and food security ahead of hazards. So, delineating or differentiating between prevention and anticipatory action.
Great, thank you. Anyone in the room who has question, I'm gonna just ask you to go to the mic, which is here. And if you could, yes, please go to the mic. The mic is here. And yes, just be as succinct as possible, please. So I'll take one or two questions. Okay, I'll take two. Yes. Please help us manage time. I'm getting the look from my colleagues that I'm not managing well time, so over to you.
Apologies for this. Very quickly, I'm Isabella Toten from Korea in the Netherlands. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Many thoughts and many feelings, because we have been in this discussion at least for the past decade plus. I have a question. Aren't we not ambitious enough? Why is from fragility to resilience okay? Because resilience is keeping it back to, that it's able to bounce back. And what is the level of ambition? What I'm thinking anti-fragile. I know you have all read that book, but what does it make that to make use of the opportunity of fragility, sorry, it sounds very ugly, but to not only build resilience, but to say, okay, I can bring it with some kind of investment to a next level, which makes it anti-fragile, which brings me to the other question I have. Who has the skin in the game? Because all the talks that we are having, everything is correct, everything is right. I cannot say I'm not agreeing with anything, with what you said, everybody. But it has to, in order for something to succeed with this very heavy agenda, everybody has to lose something. There is no way that we have agreements and negotiations and everything, and the global north, and then, the power, the duty bearers, or the national governments or other stakeholders can do, that these agreements are made like that, okay, we have a compromise, but only I don't have to give anything in. So okay. Get off risk aversion and put in your skin. We could do that too as civil society. Thank you.
Thank you.
So hi, thank you very much. I wanted just to focus very quickly on the points being made sort of across the panels around non-state armed groups, and a couple of sort of questions about how to take this forward. I mean, the people who generally work on counter-organized crime, counter-terrorism, counter-extremism, and so on, are unlikely to be in this room. They would be law enforcement, military, and intelligence, and a lot of their activities could support the work of conflict practitioners and peace builders, but it can also undermine. So how do we better engage with those communities to bring them in, given the people in this room are not going to be the leads on counterterrorism, extremism, organized crime? And with that, on the flip side, non-state armed groups don't exist for long periods of time unless they do provide services and do have connections into communities and sense of legitimacy and so on. So how does this community better understand armed groups in that way as potentially stabilizing, but certainly actors that need to be taken into account when it comes to peace building and conflict prevention activities? Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm going to turn to the panel, and I know that we're standing between you and your lunch, so we'll have to do this very quickly, but I know that with this distinguished panelists, we'll be able to do that. So on the question on differentiation between prevention and anticipatory, ASG, would you like to take on that one? Since you said that we seem to be surprised each time we have a conflict.
Yes, it's surprising that we are surprised, right?
That's true.
So every time we are hit with a conflict, and post facto we analyzed, oh, we should have realized that there was going to be there is fragility here and there is weakness there and so on. So first of all, I think for a society to be resilient, the state has to make sure the people own their development. If people don't own the development, they are not going to defend it. What made us successful in Afghanistan, I have to say, which may be an oxymoron, successful in Afghanistan, is the fact that the communities owned this development that we proposed. And when they owned it, and some of the Taliban tried to prevent women entrepreneurs from flourishing and growing and succeeding, it was the community who defended those women enterprises. So we need to make sure communities and society own this. So the role of the state is not always to deliver all the services, but to at least provide the sense of ownership by the communities of their development so they can defend it. If you look at the fragility and conflicts around the world, and I had the honor or the pleasure or whatever you want to call it of analyzing almost every conflict since the Second World War, it is always the slippery road starts with people who don't believe that they own this, and therefore they wouldn't fight for it. And that is so dangerous. Not fight in the military sense, fight in the sense of social solidarity and investing in their future and all of that. That proved to be a very dangerous link or a missing link that we need to address.
Yes. Let me turn to Deputy Prime Minister. We had a question about are we ambitious enough? Not only as a community development, community humanitarian, but as well even the countries themselves. Are we ambitious enough? And who has skin in the game? Certainly, I guess you can tell us.
Well, I'm not very sure if I can give an absolute and total answer, but I really like the questions, and I want to echo the analysis provided by my fellow panelists. First of all, we are not ambitious enough, at least in collectivity. Why are we not? Because we are operating in silos. As you mentioned, we gather here as most of you practitioners of development, but there are other actors talking about security. There are other actors talking about military operations. There are other actors talking about, private sector investment, although we do have the IFIs and others here, but there is no collective consensus on what is the right strategy. So I have recently, after visiting, IDP camps, working on food security, humanitarian crisis, national development plan, national security architecture, I have come to the conclusion after 11 years of engaging in these things that the typical fragile state is like a construction site where there is neither an owner nor an architect or a designer. There are only tradesmen and women just carrying out their work. Some are creating, making cabins, some are laying down wires, and there is no ownership. What we are talking about, when we can talk about the community level, we can talk about the household level, or we can talk about the individual level, but at the end of the day, what distinguishes the Somali child from the Swiss child is only one factor. It is in the nature and the type of state they live in. So I would highly recommend that we take a state-centric approach at the macro level, and then later on we fall into the community level. There are people who come to me and they're like, we're going to go directly to the community and talk to them about their take on the nature of justice. So we have moved on to mobile justice systems. We don't even know what that means in Somalia. It is something that has been experimented in or within some other parts of the world, and it will take us 10 years to get used to it and 10 years to reject it. So we can make life easy for most people and say, let's establish a formal or a hybrid court system in a place that has been liberated from Al-Shabaab And there are very few actors. If you look at the portfolio in Somalia's investment, development assistance, very few actors who are interested in the justice system. And that is a root cause. So my advice is, I like your analogy that we cannot treat conflict, development, insecurity, and humanitarian assistance as these very distinct, different processes. They reinforce each other. We have learned it the hard way. So the only utility we have lately is as the Somali leadership and political actors, we know what went wrong. It has to be comprehensive and collective. And that is what we will hope for. Finally, let me say this. If we do not redefine our relationship with our partners, if we don't have a consensus and agreement with our donors and our partners like the World Bank, the UN and others on what is the way to do things, then all our efforts would be in vain. And letting the country's leadership to decide and define their goals is perhaps the best place to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important yet difficult subject on security, rule of law, and who should take the leadership. So agree that it's important that countries are on the driver's seat. But these are very related issues. But we have comparative advantage as well as institutions. Some institutions are better equipped or as part of their mandate, but this issue certainly is how we should work better. So now we have a few minutes, 10 minutes left, but we have to talk about resilience. We have to be more specific. We have to help this crowd understand. Everybody talks about resilience. We use it, in many, in different ways, but we want to understand, first with you, Professor Calder, from an independent research perspective, how can you tell us about a clear understanding around resilience? In your view, as a researcher, what does it mean? And how local and international actors like us should work on it?
Well, I'm always a little bit skeptical about the term resilience. And it's partly, as I said, that the armed groups, the oligarchs, the crony capitalists all seem very resilient. And so we really are talking about the resilience of ordinary citizens in the face of crisis. And as many people have said, this really has to do with institutions. It has to do with having legitimate political institutions, whether it's at the state level or the municipality level or the local community level, that are primarily concerned about providing for the public good. And it's not institutions per se or state capacity. It's institutions that are based on what I would call a civic logic. In most war zones and many fragile conflict zones, there are states, there are municipalities, but they're based on a different logic. They are linked to what my colleague Alex de Waal calls the political marketplace. Another word would be crony capitalism or oligarchy, where the politicians are primarily interested in making money. And that's also linked very often to extremist and sectarian ideologies. And actually what you want is an institution that is based on what I've come increasingly to call civicness, a sort of social contract. Now, as we don't, a social contract between the states and the citizens. And this isn't the same, civicness is not the same as civil society. Civil society can sometimes be quite uncivic. But it's all sorts of people who really do care about the public good. Citizens like Mr. Dardari was saying are needed to, or the armed groups need just to keep the infrastructure going and whatever. It could be teachers, engineers, doctors, civil servants. But I think the problem that institutions like international institutions like the World Bank have is that we tend to think the main thing to do is to fund those people. But actually funding may act in a perverse way. Really, the point is those people are the ones who know what needs to be done. And what we really need is a kind of granular understanding, because what needs to be done is very different in different places. Yes, legitimate institutions are linked to legitimate livelihoods, which means moving from humanitarianism to development. But how to do that is very different in each area. It might be sustainable environment and sustainable energy. It might be the agricultural sector. It might be the small and medium enterprises. It's always different. And the only way to find out is to talk to the people who really care about their communities. So it involves recognizing that that's where the knowledge is, whether you're a researcher or a donor. So I think that is my most important message, that actually the job is to try to promote a kind of civicness, which is not just, which is really a political position, as a way of reversing the dominant logics of money and ideology. And just one final point. One of the questioners asked about the role of law enforcement and military and intelligence, and I actually think that's extremely important. And I think we need to start thinking about how does their actions need to change? How do we need to move away from a militaristic approach to terrorism towards one that on the one hand is very much based on the resilience of communities, but on the other hand really addresses issues of justice in an important way. So there are lots of questions related to that, and I think that was a very important question. But my main point really is, I think resilience is really about promoting civicness, which is quite a difficult thing to do.
Thank you. Yes, I wonder if I go back to my office, how I will be able to start working on improving civicness, or how ministers in this panel will be able to take that. It's complicated, obviously. So, Minister Borley, you can you tell us, using your examples in Sierra Leone or any countries of G7 plus, how really do you think we could build resilience when we're facing polycrisis? It's not just about food security. It's about, compounding challenges. How really can countries build resilience in the face of that?
Okay, thank you. Before I answer that question, I just want to comment on two of the questions from the floor. I'll try to be as short as possible. The first one is who has skin in the game? I think my fellow panelists did answer, but that's a simple answer. We that are on the ground, leaders in our country, the citizens, we have skin in the game, and I support him that we take the lead. The second question was the difference, how do we differentiate between development and I think it was humanitarian assistance? And there's a fine line between the two. One of the speakers spoke about the continuum, the absence of a continuum. And I realized this whilst we were working on post-conflict issues in Sierra Leone. And there were pockets of fragility going on, and we were doing a post-conflict plan. And I remember I had to write the section on strategy, and I was trying to describe the situation, how we go forward. We didn't know. And then I said, there's so many things happening. I'm going to call it a staggered and phased progression. I mean, that's all the... And then my colleague that was working with me said, that's not a thing. It's not a model, it's not a thing. And I said, well, it is now. And nobody questioned it, and it remained in the document. And so, it's similar to fragility. It's so complex. It is complex. We've been talking about the peace index. And it was quoted that 79 countries deteriorated within the period. But this same report talks about 84 countries also progressing. And these are countries that are in conflict or have conflict situations like Niger, Bangladesh, Guatemala, etc. So it shows that looking at resilience, it's not just an issue of conflict conflict vis-a-vis resilience. There's so many other situations of fragility that, of course, disasters, epidemics, what we call economic shocks, deepening extreme poverty, rapid urbanization, et cetera, unemployment, that all result in the polycrisis. And as the former speaker said, well, this session is too small, but if we need to be granular on all of these, I mean, you'll be doing your research for the next, is it 50 or 100 years, a time frame that was referred to. So coming specifically to G7 plus and our approaches to resilience, well, the grounded in examining actually the different conditions of fragility that our member countries are facing. And we take this, what we refer to as a resilient approach. And in this approach, we do this because it involves identifying the complex risks and in a particular crisis within a particular context, understanding the risks and how the crisis affects the whole of the polycrisis, but also the potentials. In particular, we wear both, and we realized that while resilience is much talked about in development circles, and I think every individual in the former panel gave their own views on resilience, and we probably have differing views on this panel, but we don't have, and it's necessary, we don't have a common, clear and guiding framework. That's one thing that's clear in common that we don't have for how to deal with resilience beyond sector silos. We're talking about like climate change, food security, etc. So this is what we do in the G7 Plus. We try to examine, work out the resilience and look at those that are furthest left behind, and then work out strategies within the pros and cons to see how this can be addressed in specific contexts, because one size can't fit all. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, excellent. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but I still would like to hear views of 3 other panelists on resilience. Frank, maybe not many people know that IMF has now a strategy work on countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. Can you tell us in one sentence or two, how is resilience dealt with?
Resilience is at the core. I think there is no right or wrong answer, I do believe that's why the whole point about partnership is so important. Resilience is about resilience of country, resilience about institution, resilience of people to cope with different shocks. Shocks sometimes that are completely internal, and shocks sometimes that are external. Look at climate change and others, and spillover. So I don't think there is a right or wrong answer. It's precisely, that's what we have been talking for the past hour, that you need to look at all the different angles to finally, under the leadership of the country, look at what needs to be done. The strategy of the IMF, I mean, that's what is important is really what is currently being done on the ground. I think is precisely to look at one aspect, which is how to best tailor. So it's not just about financing, but how to best tailor the approach in those countries that are facing unique challenge. And without focusing on the root cause of fragility, very difficult to provide meaningful development support or financing support. So what do we mean? We mean by this point, doing more careful, paying more attention on issues that are difficult. Governance, anti-money laundering, looking at inequality, looking at elite capture, looking at all those challenges that obviously are so important to understand what can be done within our mandate. The IMF has a different mandate than the World Bank and other actors, focusing on macroeconomic stability. Is it important regarding the FCV agenda? Big time. Without macroeconomic stability, quite difficult for a country to exit fragility. So with this engagement, we are really scaling up our support to strengthen institutions by helping those institutions to promote sound macroeconomic stability and inclusive growth, which are essential for peace and stability. Is it the only way to do it? No, it's just one piece of the puzzle. And we heard about the importance of having all the other actors, the peace, the security, the humanitarian, the development actors, under the leadership of the government. But it's an important piece. Without a well-functioning central bank, without capacity to really collect tax, without the capacity to tackle anti-money laundering, combating financing terrorism, very difficult to get out of fragility. And the last point I would like to mention, we talk a lot about prevention. So yes, there is one component which is about how can we make sure that countries are best able to cope with shocks and so that we can act faster. That's really the crisis preparedness. But there is one aspect even more important, which is I call the true prevention, which is when development comes before humanitarian, which is to ensure that those countries do not become classified as fragile and conflict-affected states. So, when I used to work, including at the bank, on this agenda, I was saying, what is your priority on fragile and conflict-affected states? I used to say, well, those that are not yet, so that they are not becoming impacted by those issues. So it's really looking at inclusive development, making sure that you have inequality that is being tackled vertically and also geographically, and making sure that we can promote inclusive growth to help those countries not falling into the trap, which is very important. So it's not only about crisis preparedness, that's important, but that's also another connotation. Let me stop here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to HG Dardari, and if you could quickly tell us how can we define or help build resilience for communities and countries?
I will be a little bit politically incorrect, but please indulge.
In two sentences?
In 2 seconds, I can say that there was a question on how ambitious are we. I think our ambition should be moving from surviving to thriving. And during this process from surviving to thriving, like what Somalia is trying to do now, we need to ensure that the society is resilient to shocks as we move along. And I believe that as we move along from survival to prosperity, the resilience of that society will improve. They become stronger because the institutions are stronger, macroeconomic institutions are stronger, and so on. The whole social contract will be stronger to shocks. So resilience, to say resilient is a static word. We are suggesting to move into a more dynamic approach to resilience, which is taking the country from where it is now to a prosperous future, very ambitious. Let's not shy away from ambition. Somalia can be something way beyond that, what we can think today. And they are showing us the proof. And many other countries can show us the way in this direction. So, thank you.
Thank you. That's politically correct that we should move from resilience to prosperity. That sounds very familiar to us. So, last but by no means least, Deputy Prime Minister, can you tell us how, building on your examples, you're building resilience in a country like Somalia? And what actors like us should do better? Actors like us, what should we do better?
Well, okay, that's a very loaded question. And I think the number one actor that needs to have a very clear objective is the state. In the absence of the state, actors don't have, especially big institutions like the World Bank, IMF, they don't have a point to anchor to and work with. In the absence of a central bank, in the absence of an Auditor General's office, in the absence of a Minister of Finance and Planning, talking about macroeconomic stability would become like a kitchen table discussion. So fixing our ways as leaders of these countries is the number one activity, and that starts with political settlements. So right now in Somalia, the Somali parliament is debating and discussing the constitution of Somalia. That has been kept as a back burner issue for the last 12 years. So how can we talk about development aspirations? How can we talk about resilience? How can we talk about investment when we are unable to complete our constitution? And that is not a responsibility that others from faraway places will do for us. So fixing the politics and the rules of the game of the polity is a necessary prerequisite, and we see that as a top priority, so we are working on that. Secondly, acknowledging the magnitude and the nature of the challenges is also a good way to begin, with the hope that we will move from survival to thriving in not so long time, maybe 10 years, 20 years. Having a clear, achievable goals is another factor that the Somali government tries to apply. So before, we used to wait for some, I don't even remember the name, the IPC, to somewhere in Geneva announce that, yes, Somalia is at the risk of a famine. Let's do something about it. That is stage 5. Something could have been done in stage 3, 2, 4. So right now, there is a project that the World Bank is working with us called Crisis Response Window that deals with preparedness, food security, emergency response, and production. So, well, we don't want to leave that burden of announcing that we are in a threat. When our house is on fire, I think we are more closer to know that there is fire. We don't have to wait for somebody looking at the smoke from faraway places. So building the right institutions to prepare for crises. Somalia has stopped dealing with crisis at crisis. We deal with crisis now as the new norm. So we know after a year, we will not have rain, we will have a food crisis, we better prepare now. But that philosophy also needs support from our partners. We have, policy trade-offs. Do we invest in security and recruit more military and police personnel to fight off Al-Shabaab? Or do we save the lives of people affected by drought? And that difficult choice is something that our partners, the IMF, the World Bank, and major donors should be able to understand and relate to our very unique situations. We're not asking for a special treatment, but some of these things are not our making, like climate change. And we hear about climate change finance, but we're yet to see it. Maybe that's another agenda we can have for a different day. So institutional building, state building, devolving power, community engagement, and sector-specific approach. If there is no investment in food security in Somalia, we always have to wait for food from World Food Program and FAO to come from Ukraine and faraway places, when Somalia has every potential to be food sufficient. So that's where private investment comes in. So I don't want to be redundant by talking about what's happening in agriculture, what's happening in fisheries. A lot of good work with our partners, but these are the foundations, and we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. So it's very hard to summarize, and I won't even try to do that because we're running out of time, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that that was a fantastic panel, and having the perspective for client countries, dealing with fragility day in, day out, the leadership that it needs, looking at the research, what we need to understand more, and we'll continue that. I think is still an area in terms of resilience that we need to continue to dig in, looking at partnership and the role of UN, IMF, and the World Bank, civil society, security actors is as well key. So we need all hands on deck, and please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. With that, I think you're invited to join lunch. I think, can you tell us about lunch? And I'm asked that I was told that we should not run away like the previous one. We should pose and take a picture.
Thank you. While the picture's going on, we have lunch and FCV Innovates. For colleagues in this room, lunch is right out the door where breakfast was. We also have